we have here. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. So chapter 22 here, we see Eliphaz, he comes back to Job and is really trying to give him his thoughts on what his situation is, why he is in the situation that he is. But he also does something towards the end of the book that's fairly interesting, at the end of that chapter. And really here we're seeing him pleading with Job to return to God. And when I thought about this chapter and how it relates to us, it's really interesting because if you were a good friend to somebody, even if you didn't believe that they were guilty of a sin or trespass that they'd committed, you'd be wanting to help restore them. And the way that I read through this particular chapter, and particularly towards the end of the book, or the end of the chapter, after he's done kind of accusing Job in the similar format that he has through the last several chapters, he says some very interesting things. Verse 23 particularly says, "If you return to the Almighty, you will be restored. If you remove unrighteousness far from your tent, and you place your gold in the dust and the gold of Ophir among the stones of the brook, then the Almighty will be your gold and choice silver to you." And I think it's interesting because at this stage now we're seeing what his ultimate goal is for Job. It isn't just to accuse him, but it's to bring him back towards the Lord. And I think that we've kind of teetered on whether or not these friends were good friends or bad friends, maybe somewhere in between. But I think at the end of the day, one thing that's very apparent is that he has Job's best interests in mind at the end of the day, and he wants to see him restored. Even if it's hard for him to believe that Job has committed some sort of act or atrocity here against God, and he's having a difficult time reconciling that. Verse 21, he says, "Yield now and be at peace with him, thereby good will come to you." Again, Job, just give it up at this point. You've done enough harm. Whatever it is that has happened in your life, please just move on. Verse 27 here says, "You will pray to him and he will hear you and you will pay your vows." And so from this chapter, I think that's really the meat of what's happened. He's trying to help Job. He wants him to come back to the Lord, and he wants to see him restored.
Even. Okay.
Yeah, Brian.
Just note that we had noted earlier that they were making sort of general accusations, but here in this chapter, he begins to make some specific accusations, saying he didn't feed the hungry, he didn't help the thirsty, he didn't clothe people that are naked, he charged security among his relatives. Now, again, I think we said for Job that those things aren't really true, so you're wondering, where is Eliphaz? But I guess he feels like, well, you've asked for some specifics, here's some specifics. And like you said, I think we got gone back and forth, are they good friends or bad friends? I think, like we often are, they're good friends, but they're confused. And they're grasping for straws, answers.
Absolutely. I think they're just wanting to find an easy solution to a very complex problem, to something that they don't understand. Why? We talked about in the last class, for anyone who wasn't here, that we don't have the context, or these people in the story right here don't have the context that we have of knowing what God and Satan have already discussed, and how he set up this trial for Job. And so all his friends are doing is looking at this from a very deceiving point of view. They're assuming fault in Job's life. Moving on to verse 20 or chapter 23 here, things shift now to Job's perspective, and we see him really searching for God again, similar to how he did in some of the previous chapters. Job is once again trying to understand where he can find God, where he can go to be at peace again. One of the verses says here, "Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come to his seat. I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments." Verses 10 through 12 here. "But he knows the way I take. When he has tried me, I shall come forth as gold. My foot has held fast to his path. I have kept his way and not turned aside. I have not departed from the command of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my necessary food. I think from these passages or these verses here, we see Job still has much confidence in the way that he's lived and the way that he's held himself throughout this entire trial. And one thing that's very interesting is that he's not backing down amidst the accusations from his friends. He's still very sure of himself. He's very sure of his faith, and he's very sure of where he stands before God. So we really need to probably keep moving, but I'll pause there and see if anyone has any comments over just those two particular chapters before we keep going. Not everyone at once. Okay. So in chapter 24 here, we see Job start to question really how God treats those that do wrong. And he opens here by asking the poignant question, why are times not stored up by the Almighty, and why do those who know him not see his days? He's wondering why people that are sinful or not blameless before God, why they don't incur the same punishment as Job has here. We see in other verses as from the city men groan, and the souls of the wounded cry out, yet God does not pay attention to folly. And this is a very reasonable expectation from Job. Up until this point, he really hasn't asked that question. He's been very distraught at his own state, but he hasn't yet started to question the intentions of how God deals punishment or how he repays evil. And so he's at the point now in his suffering, physically for sure, and emotionally for sure, to where he's starting to ask those questions. And that kind of gets us into our first question here. Is, we see Job start to question how God deals with sinful people, how he repays those deeds. Why do you think he's starting to ask those questions?
He's trying to understand God and how he acts or how he deals out judgment. Mm-hmm. Because he's left questioning, as you see in chapter 23, he said, I've yearned after God's word more so than even food. And so that puts in perspective, after all these accusations from his friends, how much he's actually treasured God. But yet here he is dealing with all these things. And so Job, as I would say, why? And he's trying to understand. And somebody told me this long ago, and I've said it many times, but if we can ever figure out God and why he does things, then he ceases to be God. And it's not that we can't still ask the question of why at any point, but I don't think it's for us to fully comprehend all of what God does. Just for instance, who knows if Job was even privy to that conversation that God and the devil had in chapter 1, with God allowing Job to be tested by the devil. And that also kind of brings into perspective, when we're tested, is it because God thinks that we're worthy and we're capable of withstanding that test or not? But it's not always for us to understand why.
Absolutely. One of the things that Lawrence said recently in a sermon is that, we can't live very long without hope. And I think at this point, Job is realizing how much he's put into his relationship with God, how much he's drawn close to God, how much he's followed him. And here he's really being challenged in how much he's done that. And he's asking why. And asking why these things have happened to him when he has made such a deep deposit into that relationship with him.
Yeah, it's really a moving chapter, I think, chapter 24, because it expresses some of these things that, again, have been expressed through millennia and certainly contemporary times that we've mentioned. Why are innocent children in some place? Why are they suffering? Why? And yet, people who are far from innocent seem to be living. I mean, Job says things like, the father's child is snatched from the breast, the infant of the poor is seized for a debt. that, there seem to be these inequities of life that Solomon raises in Ecclesiastes. And now, like you said, he hasn't really been looking at this much, but these really begin to stand out to him. That not only am I innocent of suffering, but there seems to be a lot of this going on in the world.
As I say, it's super reminiscent of the Habakkuk's or Zephaniah's or whoever within the end of the minor prophets, where these people who are failing are almost wanting to shift the focus to the rest of the world and asking God, why are they not getting punished worse than us? Why are they part of whatever this plan is? Again, kind of redirecting from why are we being punished, put into captivity, whenever, when there's something else. And for Job, when his life is so wonderful, I mean, I can't imagine these are thoughts that he was having 24 chapters ago. But when you are being, in your mind, unjustly punished or persecuted or whatever, it's a really normal question, why not these other people who are doing these awful things? Because the tail end of 23, it's him talking about God being unchangeable and who can oppose him. So it's really this what am I even going to do about it anyway? When the evil persists, when will God judge? Yet I go through this. It just seems like he's really verbally expressing, I don't know what to do, and I don't know if I've just been wrong this whole time. He just is really kind of at a crossroads of where to go at this point.
Yeah, you mentioned something there, and you said, why am I suffering when this may be happening to somebody else? And what I think is important about that is when we're suffering, particularly in an unjust way that we feel we don't deserve, we begin to compare ourselves to somebody else or to other people suffering or other people that may not have to endure what we're enduring. And this is something I know very, very closely because I'm a twin, actually. I have a twin brother. So growing up, it was just standard procedure to compare myself to my brother, and particularly in different times and stages of our lives. But I think that that's a really interesting point because it's so easy for us today, and I think particularly with the internet and different social media, for us to instantly compare and either validate or invalidate our assumption about why we're suffering, who is or isn't suffering, and what the source of that really is. Any other comments there? Okay. One other point here that I think is important to keep in mind is that Job's not able to see how God deals with people afterwards. And that's something that I think is very applicable to us today when we're tempted to compare ourselves, particularly in our suffering, is we're not able to see how God judges that person, how God judges their situation. That's something that's done long after we're gone, after they're gone. And only focusing on that is going to bring us sorrow, make us resentful, and make us bitter. So up until this point, it's natural for Job to question his choice to live a godly life. And we started to talk a little bit about this towards the end of the class, but I think at this point in the book of Job, it makes more sense to actually have more of a discussion around this. But Job is really questioning, his choice to be righteous, to be blameless before God. And I think this is extremely applicable to us today, in our suffering that we have to endure as Christians, particularly in parallels to the New Testament. That being said, why does it make sense to be righteous even though we have to endure suffering? Bueller? Christ?
I mean, he's the prime example of suffering while being the perfection of righteousness.
Right.
And I think if even if any of us found ourselves in Job's shoes and dealt with loss of your family and all your livelihood, I think that it still pales in comparison to what Christ suffered in this life for us before we were even present, long before we were present. And so when you ask the question, why be righteous in the face of suffering? Christ.
Christ, the ultimate example. I agree with that.
Your question begs the question, why are you being righteous to begin with? Why are you trying to serve and please God to begin with? Is it, like someone used the term last week, I think, or last class, a transaction? Do you have a transactional relationship with God? I'll do this if you do that, or I'm doing this because you do that. I mean, there's some of that, I think, even in the right relationship. But why do we serve God to begin with? Is it because of what we get or because of who He is?
I think that's an important point. It definitely could be, why do we do this? Is it because we love God? Or is it because we're expecting something? Right.
I don't know if this is another way, I don't know if it's the same question or not, but why am I being righteous in the face of, why am I being righteous? And you discover it's for the wrong reason. Then you discover in tests and times like this that it doesn't last, it doesn't get you through. And so I haven't been through what Job has been through to those extremes certainly, but it's one of those answers that if you are looking for the actual answer, you get a much better perspective of it incrementally as you have come through some trials in your life. And part of us being exposed to this is maybe we can get some of it through this, but when you come through trials, you come through out the other side, however that happens, even near the end of your life, you can start to see why trying to be righteous affects you in your life deeply. It's like I said, increment.
I think that it gives suffering a little bit of meaning behind it. You're not just like suffering for a lost cause. You're suffering and you're also like putting God first, and you're able to dwell with the Lord and He's with you. And I think that that's also a really important time for your faith, is to suffer.
That's a great point. Giving suffering meaning. I think if you look at people that you may or may not know, maybe you've been doing this yourself, but when you become the most resentful in your life, I think is usually when you endure suffering that you can't attribute meaning to. And that's a natural response, is to become resentful, to become bitter. But that's to your point of Christ. That's what Christ gives us, is meaning for that suffering. It's not hollow, it's not empty. And to lose sight of that is, I think, an extreme error, and something that Job teaches us here.
Makes me think of a couple other things to that point of, number one, it makes me think of James talking about count it all joy when we suffer.
Right.
And he's talking about it builds up our endurance. So there's that. But it also makes me think of Paul asking God to remove the thorn in the flesh, whatever that was.
Right.
And God's answer to him was, I'm all you need. My grace is sufficient. And so it can deepen our dependence, or even reestablish our dependence on Him. Because when I remember that it's not, that I don't have to get through life on my own. I have God helping me. It's, when do we see that more than in suffering? And we can show all this to other people. Suffering is good for humanity. The best, the most inspiring stories typically don't seem to come out of, when a nation is wealthy and everything's going well. The people that we idolize, the people that we remember through history, are the ones who got through incredible trials. And ultimately, you can't do that without God.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
In Romans, it talks about suffering in in Romans 5:3, it says, not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. And so that just kind of further proves that there is worth in suffering and that our suffering is going to strengthen our faith. And then later in Romans 8:18, it says, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed in us. So I just thought those were some nice verses.
I think also it's not that he has an answer to his question at this point, but it's that he's asking. Like in chapter 23, he says, yet I am not silenced because of the darkness. Like when I think of a spiritual person, I think of someone who's sitting there calmly with a soft smile on their face and they've already got all the answers. I don't think of someone who's sitting in the dust kind of yelling at God all these questions that he's not getting an answer to. But he's doing exactly what he's supposed to be right now. So that's just kind of a different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Over here.
I think Emily was first. Yeah, I think you're pointing at me.
Yeah. You want to go?
Go.
Okay. I would say, is there really righteousness without suffering? You can't really be righteous if you haven't been pushed against the grain a little bit and had an option to choose to go against what might be easier, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And like, there's a book by M. Scott Peck called The Road Less Traveled. It's an older book. And the first chapter, the first line is, life's not fair. And as soon as we can accept that life's not fair, life gets easier. And I think I've seen in people in my life and with myself, there comes a point in your life when something happens, whatever it is, and you're faced with that life's not fair moment. And the other side of that, once you accept that and you become humbled by the fact that we don't deserve anything. Everything we've been given, we don't deserve, period. And once you reach that point, it's so much better, so much better with God. And I think that's what Job is been gifted, and he's working through that, but life's just not fair.
Absolutely.
I was just going to say really quickly, my son on Mother's Day was talking about a Proverbs 31 woman. He was like, Mom, you're just the best. Anyway, he was complimenting me and it was nice. But he said, you and Miss Jennifer. And he said Jennifer Earnhardt, she was a really great example for me when I was kind of building my faith. These are his words, I looked at her and her example in suffering and her perseverance in suffering, and it helped him in his walk to becoming a Christian. And so I think we suffer sometimes for other people to strengthen them in their faith.
Absolutely. Matt?
Yeah, I think it's an easy question that we ask, why does suffering even exist? And, we look to God and we ask those questions, why? And there's other people that God has tested their faith, like Abraham. If God knew the outcome, why did he even do it anyway? Well, Abraham didn't know the outcome. So he couldn't have learned anything about his faith unless God put that test in front of him. And Job is the same way. Job didn't know the outcome, even though God did. So this produces endurance, and he learns something about his faith in the midst of this suffering. And then we all are all benefactors of it too. So.
Absolutely. Last thing, then we'll have to keep moving here, but it reminded me of a passage in Galatians 6, verse 8, that says, for the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And I think this goes back to what you were saying, actually, in that we have to make a choice, and we have to be faced with that choice. And that's ultimately the reason why we should choose to be righteous during those moments is so we can bear the suffering of life without becoming corrupt. And I think this is just a very eloquent, dramatic way that's illustrated in this book particularly to teach us that lesson. Okay, let's go through here real quick. Okay, so chapter 25 now, we're introduced again to Bildad. He's going to once again have a very short reply to Job, and he's going to remind Job that man is nothing before God, that man is nothing without God. He says, as God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty, who has embittered my soul. Far be it from me that I should declare you right till I die. I will not put away my integrity from me. So that's actually Job. Okay, I'm combining all three of these things here. Job, chapters 25 through 27. We've got Bildad saying one thing, Job rebuking him, and those are his words there. He's really getting tired, right, at this point, from these catty back and forth arguments from him, having to deal with an accusation while at the same time wrapping that up in something resembling concern for him. And in chapter 27 is when he reaffirms once again that I will not declare you right in verse 5, chapter 27, verse 5. Far be it from me that I should declare you right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity. I hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach any of my days. So he's standing strong here. He's not going to once again let himself be gaslighted by his friends. He knows at the end of the day what his situation is. He knows what his actions have been, and he's not going to back down. So that's kind of leading into another question here in chapter 27. There's an important section of verses here in 13 through 23, really through the end of that chapter. And at first glance, you might take this for, an admission of guilt on Job's part to his friend here, Bildad. But really, that's not exactly what's happening here. What is Job actually saying throughout this section? If anybody's read this ahead of time.
All of us, as we go through things, especially as they're not over with quickly, our emotions, they're up, they're down, or we're coming here, back, and now, like you said, I think he seems to be, all right, the wicked really aren't going to prosper. They may for a while, but like he says here, however many children he has, the ruthless man, their fate is the sword. His offspring will never have enough to eat. There is, he reminds himself, and again, we'll see this in the Psalms, this, hey, things are right, God help, but wait a minute, you do punish the wicked. You do uphold the righteous. And he seems to be kind of talking almost to himself here.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think he's starting to catch himself and realizing that, God is a fair judge, but he may not be fair in terms of what Job is wanting. The expediency at which he wants something to happen and wants things to change is not exactly what's going to happen. Job's time is not God's time. And that's, I think, what a lot of what he's saying in this particular section ends up being. Any other thoughts or comments on that section before we move on? Okay, let's move on to chapter 28 here now. Chapter 28, we see Job starting to compare wisdom to a lot of earth's treasures, to a lot of precious things that we have innately on this earth. We see him talk about different precious metals, forging processes, copper, different materials that are made from those things, and starts to compare those to really the value of wisdom and the value that's placed on that. And he says here, and to man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. To Brian's point earlier, this is something that's going to come up again later in texts like Psalms, in Ecclesiastes. At the end of the day, whether it's the psalmist or Solomon or other great literary writers throughout the Old Testament, they realize that to fear the Lord is true wisdom and is true understanding. Yeah, Jay.
One quick comment?
Yeah.
There's one there, what you have there, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I think about maybe Seth's comment he made earlier. Just kind of looking at this from a high level, I think with this section through here, you hear kind of an argument between human wisdom and God wisdom. It's almost like there's a picture that gap is kind of closed, that you can question and argue. And I feel like it's kind of a threat to our world today, right? We take our wisdom in the world and think it's that God's wisdom's not that great, right? Ours is close. And I love the way when we get to chapter 38, God says, let me tell you something. He shows the big gap between the way God thinks and the way we think, right? And it would be very good to our society today if God would speak to us through a whirlwind and show us today how big that gap is between our wisdom and his wisdom. And I think the reason I bring that up is that you had there, that starts with the fear, right? The fear and the respect that, this guy spoke this world, God spoke the world into existence, right? So his wisdom is far greater than ours. I think when we live our lives, we need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I'll add and just say, I think Jay's point, it certainly applies in the world in general. But, these are godly men here, and these are people who care about God, speak truth about God. So it's a message for people like us sitting in this room too, who acknowledge God. But because we know some things about God and we care about it, that doesn't put us on his plate. And we got to be careful that we don't think, we got the handle on God. That's not. He's got the handle on us. We see parts of him.
Yeah, absolutely. Having his word here, having this is a massive blessing, but in a way, we can take that too far if we start to overestimate what that gives us individually. It's just a piece of God's mind at the end of the day. It's not the answer book to everything that God does and how he deals with us.
It's where the book builds that.
Yeah, I won't steal that thunder, I promise. But absolutely, I think that's a great point. And to Jay's point, at the end of the day, we compare levels of wisdom. I mean, our wisdom is fortune cookie wisdom, right? At the end of the day, compared to God, compared to what is written in this book. And I think that's a similar analogy for the way Job's really describing that within chapter 28, talking about comparing that to all the precious things that we might be able to observe in this observable world. Moving on to chapter 29 now, Job really starts to reminisce on kind of the past life that he had before this affliction took place, before he started to endure his suffering. He recounts a lot of the encounters that he used to have with fellow villagers, people in his community, children, old men, people that looked up to him, people that respected him. He was, highly esteemed. He was somebody that was well known. And that makes this situation, I think, that much more difficult for him because he wasn't just some average guy. He was very wealthy. He was also very knowledgeable. He was a respectable person. He was considered to be in high regard, and he wasn't just somebody that happened to roll the dice and get unlucky and found himself in a bad situation. And now what's really tough is he's the object of that disappointment, I think, for those people when they look at him and see his condition, when they see him in the street. And he goes through that and it actually mentions that in verse 9, the princes stopped talking, put their hands on their mouths, the voice of the nobles was hushed. He had rapport, he had credibility in his community. And I think that's really difficult for him. Any comments just generically about that chapter and how it relates to this third round of speeches before we move on?
Well, it's obvious that he had more faith in the Lord than the people that were supposedly his friends.
Yeah.
And they wanted him to give up. God knew going in that the table wasn't going to be able to convert him. Job didn't know it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, it's really interesting to me because I think I used to just look at Job in the beginning, all the loss that hits him, the loss of his children, the loss of his wealth, the loss of his health. You know, and kind of like I kept thinking that was the big loss, but Satan continues to hit him with loss. You know, and so now he's lost his reputation, his good name. And his wife is kind of said, curse God and die. He's lost the companionship and the loyalty of someone who's close to him. And his closest friends, have turned against him. And I just, you think he's at rock bottom, but then it just seems like the blows that Satan hits him with, he continues to be hit with things that, we value. The loss of reputation is hurtful. The loss of companionship is hurtful. The loneliness and despair that he must feel when he is at his lowest low and there's no one there to comfort him. I just think Satan continues to knock him down, and he doesn't just, seems like he's at rock bottom, but he's not at rock bottom until his friends beat him up really good and his wife tells him to curse God and die. I just think he keeps coming, having to hit a lower place. I don't know, and it makes me really feel for Job because his suffering it's the most suffering, I think I've ever seen. When you read the story of Job, it's like, it's all the suffering. It's everything that you can be hit with, and it's all of it. And Satan, it's just interesting. He comes at him from so many different angles. He comes at us from different angles. And it's just wise to be aware of that, and that, of course, obviously, I think Job is trying to work through this puzzle and try and make sense of it. But, when life comes at us, when Satan comes at us, it's, he can come at us from all different angles. But obviously, our relationship with God and striving to serve Him and please Him, we can get through it. But I think I feel for Job in a different way when I think of the continual blows that he's hit with.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like there's a false bottom every time you turn the page. You think that was the bottom, that was it, and yet every time you turn the page, there's something else that's happening to him. Okay, let's keep going here. This really kind of sets up chapter 30 here, where Job starts to repeat several things about his physical condition. And there are things that he's mentioned in previous chapters as well, particularly around the physical state of himself and the emotional state that he's in. But really, I think he's trying to emphasize really how he feels, particularly in this chapter. What things do you think maybe he's trying to emphasize within this portion of the chapter? I think one thing that he's trying to do is he's trying to rationalize his situation. He's trying to understand why he's made to feel this way, why he's the object of this torment, this pain. And his mind won't leave it alone, right? When something's bothering you mentally, forget about physically. Obviously, you stub your toe, you're going to know something happened. But when something's not right in your mind won't leave it alone. I joke with my wife all the time. When something's not right and I can't stop, I'm not going to let it go. I just can't. Something's not right mentally, and I just know that there's something going on that I need to talk about, that I need to understand why. And I think that's similar to what's happening to Job here within this particular chapter.
I also think, looking at mostly the middle of 29, it kind of sounds like what he's saying is, as far as I know, I've been such an instrument for God. I was eyes to the blind, I was feet to the lame. People were listening to me, and they were absorbing my wisdom. It's almost as if he's saying, God, I was such a good tool to you. Why would you diminish my effectiveness?
Yeah.
Because it's just confusing. Why would you willingly throw away a tool that's at your disposal?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I didn't think about that, but he's probably trying to reconcile how his value's been destroyed.
Now we get to see how much more God had planned for his instrument of Job, because now all of us for generations and generations get to hear this wonderful story. And so it's just another indication that we really don't know what God's doing through us, and we may never know. You may die and never know that something that you experienced and was part of God's plan. And so you live in the faith, right?
That's a great point, and since we've only got a couple minutes left, that's like one of the things that I really took from Job's story as a whole that I think makes sense to insert in here. When we endure a situation that we might say is a Job moment, we never know if God is saying, have you considered, my servant? Have you considered my servant Jay? Have you considered my servant Jordan? God may be saying that to Satan in our very instance. He may be putting us up to face something like that because he feels that we have that same capability, and I think that's really important as we go through here. Okay, I know we've gone through everything at kind of a lightning pace. We're at the final chapter here now, chapter 31, and here's where we see Job really reinsert his integrity, and again, really his blamelessness in this entire situation. In verse 7 here, he says, "If my step has turned from the way, or my heart has followed my eyes, or if any spot has stuck to my hands, let me sow and another eat, let my crops be uprooted." Here I think he's laying open his heart to say, look, if I have done something that I have let go, that I have not caught on my own, then let me be punished for that. He even goes down in verse 11 to say, "Moreover, it would be an iniquity, punishable by judges." Job's being very fair to himself in this instance, after he's already asked the why about why he's having to suffer this way, that if he had done something or has acted sinfully, then, let him endure those consequences. Do you have some? Okay, I'm sorry. And so that kind of leaves us up for the last question here. What lessons do you think we can take away from these 11 incredibly deep chapters and this third round of speeches, particularly with Job and his friends?
It's kind of already been said, but I think one of the things we see here is how much authority and power Satan has at his command, at least at certain times. And so it kind of, going back to why would we maintain a relationship with God, it's because he is the only being who can stand up to someone as powerful as Satan. None of us can do it, even if we all banded together. We have total reliance on God because we cannot overcome this ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys so much. We're going to have Job 32 through 37 on Sunday.
Elliot, I'll have a handout on both of the chairs. Study questions.